Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? Good. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Yuriana Garcia Telles. I am the Diversity Outreach and Engagement Administrator for the City of Bellevue. I, along with my Diversity Advantage team, which is led by Elena Casio, Diversity and Inclusion Administrator, and Blaine Amson, the ADA and Title VI Administrator, are what makes up the diversity team. Really happy to see you here today. I want to acknowledge our elected officials that are here today. Especially thank you to Mayor Lynn Robinson, who is going to be doing our opening remarks. I want to also acknowledge Councilmember Conrad Lee. Thank you for being here. We can give them a round of applause. Yeah. We might also be receiving a few other elected officials in a little bit. But for now, thank you so much for being here as we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Day at the City of Bellevue. This is a really special event and kickoff. We kick off this year with a keynote from Ashur Savage, which you will be hearing more about in a little bit. We celebrate Dr. King's legacy, the man who stood against the oppression of marginalized communities. As a civil rights leader, Dr. King had the vision of building a thriving future for all children, right? So we know that he said that directly in his I Have a Dream speech. And that is something that is really important for him and was important for him to visualize and see all children being successful regardless of their race or where they came from. Today's keynote will resonate with many of us because we are embedded in this work as public servants. Before we get started, I'd like to invite Arlie Nikahasi from this land who will do a traditional indigenous recognition and song. Thank you, Arlie.
With this backhoe that I've been given this morning, I've been requested to help with this event. Not that dinner, console, sweet or stunt, the kettle should be done. Jay, coffee cheese in the yet, lunch every touchy machine slam, Pensacola brush, chin, ago, torchini dust cheese. There you go. So I come from the Diné people. We are located in the Southwest. I came to the Northwest in 1981 to get my bachelor's degree in Salem, Oregon from Willamette University. Need Bearcats here. But I understand the governor is a Bearcat. Probably some of you are from Linfield and some of those Fox. That's okay. That's all right. I'll speak louder. When we do these, we don't use the mic. It has come to our attention that many people are asking at these types of events to have a land acknowledgement. Some of you may have seen that. For some of you today, it might be the first time that you've seen this. It's really important for people to understand what we're doing. Oh yeah, you can do that. And to understand when you do these, what are you actually saying? What we'll be doing this morning is something that goes back deep into the history of this land. In the history that I learned as a young child in America, I saw how our people were classified as uncivilized, as savage, as warlike, bent upon only fighting, and pretty well backwards. But I'm telling you, what you have here today is the result of all of that. When the first Europeans came here, they found a land with no emperors, no conquerors. Because the original way of this life is the respect for each and every way of life. No people has the right to impose upon other people's freedom of their religion, of their languages, of their way of governance. We have held to that truth for tens of thousands of years. The verified dates right now are around 20,000. There are dates, one by San Diego, of over 100,000. So some of these things in America are put forward like, liberty and all these things, freedom began then, but it didn't. As indigenous people, we still hold sacred to that. I was taught as a young boy, whenever I traveled across the lands, my father would always say, son, these are the homelands of the Kiowa people. Son, these are the homelands of the Blackfeet people. And I learned from him a very important lesson, that wherever we go, we show that respect. That's what we're going to do here this morning. My father taught me, whenever you do that, son, whenever you do that, whatever you do will fall into place. Everything will be built from that in a good way. And I myself, a visitor to this land from the Southwest, I also do this when I perform ceremonies, when I do traditional prayers. It is very, very important and crucial. Those of you whose original homelands are across the sea or other areas, when I've traveled to many places. I've traveled to Japan. I've traveled to France, the Middle East, Italy. When I was in those lands, I had the highest respect because I'm a visitor in your home. And I had the highest respect and respectful way because anything I did that was embarrassing or shameful was embarrassing to my people. When you live by this, it doesn't do anything but cause you to have that deep respect. So it's in that tradition, in that line, what we're going to do today. We are here on these lands of the Coastal Salish people who have lived here for thousands of years. Right now, the Bellevue School District is collaborating with the Snoqualmie Nation to develop curriculum of the history of the Snoqualmie people in this area. There are the other coastal tribes, Salish coastal tribes in this region. And we acknowledge them this morning for all that they have done to care for this land. The waters, the forests, the plants, the medicines, all the prayers, all the ceremonies that they have done through time, all the sacrifice that they have done, the blood that was shed. We acknowledge them. And we ask them to look kindly upon us, our thoughts, our mind, what we come here for today, this thought and this idea put forth by this man, that they will look kindly upon that. And however they can, that they will encourage us. So at this time, I'm going to ask Yuriana to come forward. What is the purpose of this gathering?
The purpose of this gathering is to come together to bring light to the injustices that still exist within education system, within our society as a whole, for our children and the generations that are going to come after us.
Who are your people? Where do you come from?
I'm from Michoacán, Mexico, Purepeche.
Thank you. That's good. So you've heard the intentions spoken by her of this event. I honestly believe, as our elders teach us, you look outside that window, you see those trees right there. Wherever you travel around, you see the earth, you see life. One of the things our elders talk about is that humanity has lost its way. We've disconnected ourselves from nature. We build these things and make it look like we're isolated by ourselves, but no, we are deeply connected to everything. And we honestly believe in our ways. When we speak in intention, when we have something in our mind and our heart that follows that way of beauty, that way of harmony, that way of wellness, that way of partnership, that they will help you. Even the plants, the waters, they'll help you. The animals, they'll help you. Every day they're going about the business of keeping life going. Every day they go about that business. And when they hear us as humans state that, listen to what they said. Let's go help them. What they're doing, want to do is a good thing. Let's go help them, you guys. That's what we believe. Old ways. And we believe all the indigenous people of Earth have kept that truth. So with this morning, with these thoughts, I wanted to share too. Also, right now, Bellevue School District is about to launch in the district the acknowledgement of the Snoqualmie Nation of being on their traditional homelands. And with that, there will be flags that will be placed at the district offices and at various schools across the region. So this is something, and it's happening all across America. I'm very proud of it. I want you to understand that we as indigenous people, we have no desire to oppress you. We have no desire to conquer you. We have no desire to force our languages upon you. Our desire is that we all live together in the greatest level of respect and partnership that we can. So in our way, we have songs. And when we sing these songs, we take this thought that she spoke, the thoughts in your mind and heart, and we send them out. And it's with this, we send these thoughts and out, and we declare who we are and what we're doing. So with that, I'm going to share this song. It's appropriate to stand at this time. Hey, hey, yo, hey, yo, hi, yo, hey, 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 yo, hey, hey, yo. Hey, hey, yo, hey, hi, yo. Hey, yo, hey, 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 yo, hey, 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 yo, hi, yo, hey, 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 yo, hey, yo, hey, 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 yo, hey, yo, hey, yo. Hey, 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 hi, yo, hey, hey, hi, yo, I, yo, hey, hey, yo, hey, yo, hey, yo, hey, yo. Hojona Hastli, Hojona Hastli, Hojona Hastli, Hojona Hastli. Beauty is all around us.
Thank you, Arlie, for that beautiful blessing and intention set forth for our time today. Next, I'd like to bring in Ross McCommon, who is going to be renditioning the Black National Anthem. Please sing along if you know, and if you don't sing along, Car is going to be also having the lyrics there as well. Thank you. And
Hi, I also like to have you stand for our Black National Anthem, please. And those of you who know it, please sing out along with me. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers died. We have come over a way that the tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who has brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by Thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met Thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget Thee. Shadowed beneath Thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Thank you. Have a seat.
thank you so much, Ross, for the talent that you bring to the city and singing the Black National Anthem today. Now we're going to go ahead and invite up to the stage Mayor Lynn Robinson. Congratulations, and Mayor Lynn Robinson will be giving opening remarks as well as introduce our keynote speaker for today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I am supposed to start with our council vision statement, but I'd rather hear it from you. So can we start with Bellevue? We embrace our future while respecting our past. I have to think about that one too. And I want to remember that more as we move into the next few years, because as we progress so quickly as a city, I think it becomes more and more important to respect our past. So there's only one person that the city of Bellevue celebrates annually, only one person that really we honor in almost a whole week celebration. And our city works very hard to put this event on today to make it a special representation of somebody who has so affected our history and our future and our present. And we work very hard to find the appropriate speaker. And so you can imagine I was a little surprised when I saw we had a high school student speaking today. And I was mostly surprised because I don't know a single high school student who has the confidence or the courage to speak in front of a group like this. But I assure you, the more that I've gotten to know our speaker, the more I understand and appreciate. Hi, this is our new council member, Jeremy Barksdale. Our speaker is worthy of this role, is what I'm trying to say. Azure Savage is a self-described trans, queer, Black senior high school student from Seattle who's taken his own life experiences of feeling marginalized, of feeling underrepresented, and turned it around to ask his fellow high school students what their experience is in high school. And through his research, he has found that he is neither alone, nor is it his fault. And he is actually a published author with his memoirs, let's see, You Failed Us, about the Seattle School District. As Nietzsche has said, much greatness is derived from pain. I want to thank you, Azure, for having the courage to come today and to speak about your experience and to be an advocate for all those who have felt some of the pain that you have felt, who have felt marginalized and underrepresented. And I thank you for coming today to speak to us at Bellevue City Hall. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Lynn Robinson, for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank the previous presenters for their words and their songs. My name is Azure Savage. I am the author of You Failed Us, Students of Color Talk Seattle Schools. Before I go any further, I can't talk about the present state of this country without reminding others and myself of the historical framing. The United States was established on the practices of exploiting land and labor through the genocide of indigenous people and enslavement of African people. The original colonizers of the land we now stand on have set the stage with a society bound by the need for white supremacy to reign. We are taught that this is a distant past we've moved far away from, both with our practices and beliefs as a nation, that the changes make it irrelevant to the country's present and future. That's not what I see. What I see is Black people murdered by the police. I see our prisons filled with Black and brown bodies. I see immigrants searching for a different life, only to end up imprisoned and have their families torn apart. I see the neighborhood I grew up in gentrified, historical and cultural landmarks torn up for profit. I see billionaires in a city with a homelessness crisis. That's the reality I wake up inside every day. I could spend the rest of my time simply listing countless impacts of instilled racism and white supremacy in this country. I always feel overwhelmed with the vast amount of injustice and inhumanity. As a young person, feeling small and powerless within everything, I wanted to at least understand and impact the spaces I occupy. I started to really comprehend the racism in our schools when I was around 14 years old, after years of bottling up my experiences that I had because of my race. Instantly, I was consumed with anger, but behind that, there was a lot of fear. I spent a few years feeling hopelessly stagnant, bound in this institution tied directly to racism and feeling the harm that it caused. There came a point where stagnancy was no longer an option for me. I could not sit by and watch students of color year after year being harmed by the system that should be giving them opportunity. I've challenged myself to separate the system of education with education itself. I do fully believe that the concept of education has good intentions. I believe that there are people who work in education who genuinely want to improve the current state of it. I'm able to hold space for acknowledging the good work that has been done within our schools while still critiquing the institution as inherently racist. The overall experience for communities of color in education illustrates the racism that continues to be perpetuated. There's a plethora of quantitative data from research about inequitable and racist trends in education. Some people really like numbers, and seeing the data is what makes them believe there's an issue. But I haven't seen mass action come from this alone. I want to reframe the conversation we have around education and other societal issues to no longer center statistics and start centering human voice and experience. That's the exact intention behind my book, because movements aren't started by numbers. They're started by people, stories, and emotion. My heart has been crushed over and over again by the real-life stories that people share with me that I read about online and in books. It's so tempting to check out of everything going wrong, but reminding myself of the people impacted keeps me going. I've gone to school in Seattle for my whole life, and I tested into the program in Seattle called the Highly Capable Cohort in kindergarten. I started it in first grade, and I can name that as one of the biggest life-altering events in my childhood. This program is stated to be for students who are exceptionally bright, to the point where they just can't function in a typical classroom. That's not what I think it is, or even what I believe it's intended to be, but that's how it's described. In my book, I write a lot about my experience in this program as a Black student. In the program, only 1% of students are Black. I was in that 1%. To share with you a little more about my experience in this program, I'm going to read the introduction to my book. When I was in elementary school, every year my teacher would take individual pictures of all the children in the class and then hang the pictures on the wall. I always refused to have my picture taken. I was the only Black student in my class every year, and I constantly noticed the differences between me and the other students. I didn't want everyone who walked into the room and looked at the wall of pictures to notice that I was different too. I wanted to be invisible. As much as my teachers begged me, got irritated with me, or even called my mom, my picture never made it up on the wall alongside the smiling faces of the rest of my class. I hated being in those classes at the time, and looking back, I hate what it did to me as a child. My experience was different from most Black students because, as I said, very few are in that program. That's how I felt in the program, and on the other side, students of color who were placed into general education can attest to feeling inferior, mistreated, and unimportant. The common experience we can all share is experiencing racism throughout our time in school. Students of color in both programs are severely harmed mentally, but where I had academic advantages, other students did not. The conversation on the existence and structure of an advanced cohort is booming. To keep it simple, I fully believe the program has to be dismantled. I'm not someone who works in education. I don't have a degree in policymaking, but as a student of color who has experienced it firsthand, here are my main reasons. One, a huge piece of the education experience should be to work with people from different backgrounds and not be in an isolated bubble. Two, individual needs can be met without separating different types of learners from each other. And three, the program's existence establishes a hierarchy in schools that perpetuates ideas of inferiority and superiority. I'm not going to go much further into the first two of my reasons because they focus more on education policy specifically. The third, however, can be broadened into aspects of society as a whole. As much as people can say that the honors program isn't about being superior to other students, the name itself in Seattle, highly capable cohort, directly insinuates that these students are somehow above the rest. Especially when students are exposed to this program at a young age, we instantly simplify it into that students in the honors program are smart and students who aren't are dumb. When being smart is the #1 trait valued in schools, a hierarchy is instantly created with its existence. The desire for separating students into a distinguished group comes from society's need to have people who are seen as superior to others. It can be argued that this is a positive aspect of society because people need motivation to be productive and work hard. This argument comes from a capitalist-based mindset that instills the idea that only a select few are deserving of status, wealth, and power, and others are not. We can see this ideology in action extremely well in the greater Seattle area. We have billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates who have accumulated more wealth than they could ever possibly need, but are somehow respected by many for the hard work they've done to get there. We also have a massive population of homeless individuals who are disrespected because of the narrative that homeless people are responsible for their state of life because they haven't worked hard enough or contributed to society. However, the people most likely to become homeless are born into poverty. And people in the lower class are the ones working long-hour jobs for little pay. Even though the work that they do is necessary for capitalism to function, it's normalized for human rights and basic needs of survival for this group to be negated in order for an elite class of people who hoard the resources to exist. Keeping the upper class rich is more important than keeping the lower class alive. I see a similar concept with the honors program. It seems like for many people, it's more important for the best students to receive an incredible education than for other students to receive any educational opportunity. And for both the issue of wealth distribution and the honors program, racism is deeply ingrained. People seen as less important are the people of color. The honors program, as well as selective private education, begins the process for selecting individuals to fill the limited positions for excellent and superior people in society. And it's not a coincidence that the majority happen to be white. The capitalist-based need for only a handful of people to have individual success, instead of searching for collective empowerment, has impacted the way we view group dynamics. We still have a socialized need to create a hierarchy. In almost every group of people, there is always one person or a few people that are pointed to as the main contributors. There's a desire for not only someone to step up as the leader, but for there to be a known face of the group, and for a person to be credited with the accomplishments even though they were not responsible for everything the group did. They're the ones who receive recognition, gain fame or infamy, and others involved can be forgotten in the shadow. It restructures collective efforts into an individual effort backed by a collective. The civil rights movement in the 60s instantly brings specific names to people's minds, the first almost always being Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I learned about Dr. King from a very early age. The first time I can recall was when I was in first grade. Throughout my years in elementary and middle school, I consistently learned about him. We continued to be taught about the accomplishments he had in the civil rights era, including Selma, the March on Washington, and his I Have a Dream speech. I always loved and looked up to Dr. King. He was a hero for me, a dream in action, and a symbol of change. More than the specific events I learned about, what I most took away from those lessons at a young age was his vision that was taught. The concept that through peace, love, and persistence, one could make a change and be loved as a figure in history. Dr. King was an incredible individual. He made impacts in society that have remained long after his life ended. But I want to challenge the idea that these should be referred to as his accomplishments. He was the face of all of this. He was a leader within it. Still, I don't think we can or should individualize a collective movement. This wasn't only Dr. King. This wasn't only Dr. King and the other famous civil rights leaders. The accomplishments during the 60s were accomplishments of the people. They were accomplishments of the lesser-known civil rights leaders. They were accomplishments of the children washed down the street with water hoses during the Children's March. They were accomplishments of the college and high school students who were harassed, beaten, and even killed during sit-ins. They were accomplishments of the men and women who walked to work every day during the Montgomery bus boycott. Peoples whose names were never mentioned. I can see both that Dr. King was an incredible visionary, and also that every single other person involved who acted because they could see a different future was a visionary as well. Dr. King was the central figure represented in my education around the civil rights era, and the two others were Rosa Parks and Ruby Bridges. Until I started learning more outside of public education, I really thought that those were the three people who made up this movement. Malcolm X was a name I'd heard of, but never really taught substance on. There's a deliberate reason why those were the three people I was taught about in school. I read an article called "Civil Rights Protests Were Never Popular" that I found profound in my community college English class in my junior year. It was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates and posted to The Atlantic in 2017. For context, this article is in response to another article by David Leinhart posted to the New York Times. It criticizes the effectiveness of kneeling protests brought to attention by Colin Kaepernick because they do not coincide with American values as Dr. King did, so therefore they will be seen negatively by the public. Coates first fact-checks Leinhart's narrative that the civil rights movement led directly to white support and the passage of the Civil Rights Act. He corrects this to be that white support did not only come from supposed acceptance of the movement's missions, it also came from self-interested motives, such as the threat of urban rebellion. In addition, the general opinion on King was negative. A poll in 1963 came back with 63% of Americans having an unfavorable opinion of him. This directly contradicts Leinhart's position that Kaepernick would be more effective if he was more like Dr. King, because the kneeling protests poll is nearly identical, with 64% of Americans disapproving. The fact is, protests both then and now were not welcomed by the public, whether they were done peacefully, violently, or somewhere in between. All activists, protesters, and community organizers should not be deluded to think that they're being ineffective if the public isn't in their favor. Clearly, something about the public opinion on Dr. King has changed, since now nearly every American grows up learning about him. The reason for this is because over time, his image was able to be painted into one that wasn't controversial, making it easier for people to get behind and act like the majority always was. Dr. King's true story and vision is toned down to have him to fit in a box of what an ideal social activist should look like. But he was not attempting to fit in the box that people now keep him in. He was radical. He pushed against the limits of society through any means necessary, aside from violence. Even though he had peaceful messages and tactics, those didn't matter at the time he was alive. They only mattered once they could be used as a tool to condemn and silence radicalism. America has done Dr. King a great disservice with the way his legacy has been manipulated into something it was not. Over the years after his death, he's become such a carefully curated figure in history that his humanity has become less important than what he can symbolize. There was a real man, not that long ago, who was doing hard work in communities. He wasn't always the symbolic figure of peace and acceptance. He had other strong beliefs that he developed over time. Near the end of his life, a piece of Dr. King's work that is rarely talked about was his growing interest in anti-capitalism and working on the issue of poverty. A quote he gave in a speech in 1967 stated, "We must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order." It's not a coincidence that as he became more public with his anti-capitalistic ideas, he became seen as more of a threat to the nation. We aren't taught in school about this piece of Dr. King's legacy because it directly interferes with the narrative that he was an American-loving man who wanted black and white kids to be friends. Since this occurred right at the end of his life, it was able to be carefully removed from his known legacy, and for him as a historical figure to remain non-threatening. There's a pattern with what gets left out of history books. Including, but not limited to, this history around the civil rights era, the history that students are currently being taught in school is important to reevaluate. I grew up learning about entirely Eurocentric history, and I learned nothing about my own ancestry. The world history curriculum, for example, should be called European and colonial history, because that more accurately describes what is covered. We focus on Europe, and the only time other places and people are brought into the story is when white people contact them. Students of color are negatively impacted by this lack of representation in the curriculum. It sucks to feel like your history doesn't matter. When I was doing interviews for my book, many students brought up the feeling of being unrepresented or misrepresented in school. Here is some of what they had to say. "My native culture is important to me and a big part of who I am. Every year in school, in history class specifically, there's a day or two set aside where we talk about Native American people and the culture. It's happened every year I can remember. it's the same talk every time, usually about how they're represented in the media or stereotypes. It's important to realize that there's a lot more to Native people and Native culture than stereotypes. The rest of the year, Native people are sort of forgotten about. Unfortunately, I've noticed this happen with a lot of non-white history. And another student shared with me, the most representation I've had is learning about the Harlem Renaissance and slavery. There's nothing about the inventions and achievements of Black people. What we learn about the history of Black culture and the US history of slaves is warped sometimes. A lot of my history teachers said that there was already similar systems of slavery in Africa, so when white people took slaves from Africa, the system was already occurring, and it was just bringing slavery to America. This was not accurate at all. I focus mainly on race in my book because I do believe it's at the heart of this issue. But it's important for other identities to be represented within education. Many students of color are grappling with understanding other parts of themselves in addition to their race. As someone who is Black, queer, and trans, no aspect of my identity was thoroughly talked about or even mentioned at all in school. Another piece from my book illustrates the experience I had with this. I started really questioning my gender and sexuality when I was around 14, in 8th grade. It was a difficult transitional period for me because I didn't have any resources to guide my exploration. I wasn't even fully aware of transgender people until middle school, and I'm pretty sure it was because of Caitlyn Jenner. I came out publicly when I was 14 as bisexual. It went fine. Most people couldn't have cared less. Still, I didn't have any information on what my identity means. Teachers never spoke on the queer community, even in my health class. Later that year, when I started to dig into my gender, I had a similar feeling of confusion and lack of representation. I had nothing to guide me. A piece of history that ties both to the civil rights era and queer history is the story of the Stonewall riots in 1969. In Greenwich Village in New York City existed the Stonewall Inn, which can be described as a safe haven, not limited to, but mainly for lower-class queer and trans people. The owners of the inn had connections with NYPD and could usually maneuver around any legal trouble, allowing the business to remain cheap for customers by cutting expenses that would normally get a business shut down. That relationship with the cops ended unexpectedly on June 28th of 1969. Cops came in randomly and began to harass those inside. This harassment included checking the real sex of suspected transgender people and cross-dressers, proceeding to arrest them because it was illegal to dress in that way. In total, 13 people were taken under arrest. The community there, that included gay, lesbian, and transgender people, united in their outrage and violently rioted. I want to emphasize the importance of this collective action before I name a specific individual. The Stonewall Riot, which is one of the key events in beginning the fight for queer and trans liberation, would not have been possible if the people were divided, and it's generally seen as the collective action that it is. Still, I want to highlight a Black woman named Marsha P. Johnson. Even though everyone involved agrees the specifics don't really matter, Marsha P. Johnson is usually credited with throwing the first brick at Stonewall, a moment frozen in time that began the events that followed. Marsha was alive before the term transgender even existed, so she would usually refer to herself as a cross-dresser, drag queen, or transvestite. If people know who Marsha is at all, it's usually in the context of Stonewall, but in no way did her community work start or end there. An article on CNN by Christina Maksouris creates a picture of the reach Marsha had. She founded one of the first safe spaces for trans homeless youth and advocated tirelessly on the behalf of sex workers, prisoners, and people with HIV/AIDS. The work that she did in her life landed her in the same position as many other community organizers. Marcia was found dead in a river at 45 years old. Police immediately ruled it a suicide, but friends and family are certain that this was a murder. Marcia was a fighter, and as a Black transgender woman doing radical work, she was in the line of fire. I'm going to preface this part by saying this is the hardest part for me to do in this speech. It really hurts my heart. Black trans women have always been sought out and murdered. It's been getting some more attention now, but not enough is being done about it, and the count of lives lost is only increasing. I want people to remember them, and I want to remember the sisters in my community that I never got to meet, and now never will. I'm about to read out a whole lot of names, and I urge you to not only hear these words, but to feel each human life that was lost. Rita Hester, Amanda Milan, Loni Kai, Nerea Johnson, Letitia King, Letitia Tish Green, Simi Lewis Williams Jr., Victoria Carmen White, Stacy Blahnik, Marsal Camaro Tai, Dee Dee Pearson, Shelley Treasure Hilliard, Crane Conaway, Dione Jones, Coco Williams, Terrell Jackson, Paige Clay, Brandy Martell, Tiffany Gooden, Deja Jones, Kendall Hampton, Ashley Sinclair, Brittany Nicole Kidd Stergis, Samia Cece Dove, Dominique Newburn, Evan Young, Erica Morgan, Islan Nettles, Kelly Young, Yasmin Shanses, Tiffany Edwards, Mia Henderson, Anaya Parker, Ashley Michelle Sherman, Brianna Gizzy Fowler, Deshonda Sanchez, Poppy Edwards, Lamia Beard, Ty Underwood, Yasmin Vash Payne, Penny Proud, Keishia Blige, London Chanel, Ashton O'Hara, India Clark, Shade Schuler, Amber Monroe, Candice Capri, Alicia Walker, Kiasha Jenkins, Zella Ziona, Shantae Thompson, Kiona Blacchini, Reese Walker, Goddess Diamond, Daniquia Dodds, Dee Wiggum, Raylyn Thomas, Titi Safor, Jazz Alford, Brandy Bledsoe, India Monroe, Mesha Caldwell, Jaquarius Holland, Tierra Lachey the Boss Richmond, China Doll Dupree, Sierra McCleven, Alfonso Watson, Cheryl Faulkner, Kenny McFadden, Diamond Stevens, Dejanay Staten, Brianna B.B. Hill, Malaysia Booker, Michelle Tamika Washington, Dana Martin, Jazalyn Ware, Ashanti Carmen, Claire Legato, Chino Lindsay, Chanel Skurlock, Zoe Spears, Brooklyn Lindsay, Denali Berry Stuckey, Tracy Single, Bubba Walker, Kiki Fontroy, Jordan Kofer, Pebbles Ladime Dime Doe, Bailey Reeves, B. Love Slater, Jamahio Jamar Berryman, Italy Marlowe, Nikki Kuhnhausen, Yahira Nesby, Nino Acox Jackson, DeMarcus Stansberry, and Kenneth Bostick. I refused to just pick a few of these names to share because they all deserve to be remembered equally. And I think that they should be spoken and heard as many times as possible. While I was looking for these names, I found 98 hate-based murders of Black trans people, primarily trans women, since 1980 in the United States alone. It's common for these to be ruled as suicides or for transphobic families to not mention that they were trans, and I probably missed a few of the names along the way, which means that the death toll is likely higher than what it's recorded at. The youngest was only 15. I spent a whole night searching for their names, taking the time to research each one, seeing pictures of their beautiful faces, and comprehending that they have all been murdered. I told you this was hard for me. A large amount of these murder cases remain unsolved. The grief I felt by the time I finished was nauseating. I already knew that this was the reality, but this was the first time I ever forced myself to truly face it. I fear every day to hear that one of my friends has joined this list. I'm relatively safer as a trans man because I'm not impacted by trans misogyny, but seeing Black trans men who have been murdered because of their identity makes me fear for my own life. Both as a society and within specific communities, we haven't had enough conversations on transphobia and the impact that it has on the transgender community. I think that school is the obvious place to have these conversations, to start talking and learning. I wish that my education had included learning about Marsha, what it means to be trans, and how that intersects with being Black too. There's many issues that remain invisible until someone intentionally brings them to the light. I've brought up some, definitely not all, of the somewhat hidden pieces of the civil rights movement that are often unknown to people who don't seek it out. There are things that I learned as I began to dig into this topic. I think it's important to remember the radical work that was done during this era and the radical people that it involved, because radicalism today is often spoken about as if it's brand new. I hope that after hearing some of the truth, people won't revert to their previous understanding of this era, especially when addressing Dr. King. I want to remember him the way that he deserves to be remembered, and not continue the whitewashed version of his legacy. The work that was started during this movement and the work that Dr. King was beginning near the end of his life is far from finished. There's an immense amount of information about the era that organizers today can learn from to figure out which direction we want to go in and the tactics we can use to get there. One of the biggest lessons I've learned from analyzing this movement is the importance and power of collective action. I've always held myself to a high standard to be a leader within the organizing work that I do, whether it's in a school club, a community organization, or on my own. I've realized that it's less important to show up as a strong leader than to show up as myself and be part of the work in any capacity. I see that I'm recognized often as a youth leader, but I want people to understand that my abilities are tied directly to the love and support of my community. Even this keynote is something that I put my time and labor into, but it hasn't been a solo process. I've relied on support from the mentors in my life, my peers, and my mom to push harder. I wouldn't have been able to write my book without the other students of color who contributed by telling their story. With the anti-racist work I've been doing in education since I released my book, I've been wary of becoming a spokesperson for all students of color. Being the face of any movement or cause is not something I'm interested in being. I'm simply one of many people making the impact they can. I know that my life purpose is to be part of a revolutionary movement, but I don't think that the goal for myself or anyone interested in community work should be to become a known leader like Dr. King. All we can do is our own part in the fight for justice and liberation of Black and brown people. Every single one of us is important, and no one has to be more important than anyone else. I'm only 18 now. I'm still trying to figure out where I want to go in my life and the impact I want to make. The education system stood out to me as a starting point because it's a system that I'm familiar with and have direct access to. But I don't necessarily see myself limited to anti-racist work solely in education moving forward. A big part of why is because I don't think we can look at racism in schools as an isolated issue when it's connected entirely to a country based in white supremacy. Work can and should be done in the meantime to improve the experience for students of color, allowing us to be relieved of some of the harm that we face now, but reform is not going to be a long-term solution. What I've been drawn to recently is envisioning ways to transform the world we have now into something that can only be described as utopian. We can transform our schools while we transform everything else. I think that one of the greatest gifts humans have is our imagination. And when we're looking for creating big changes, we have to begin by imagining what we're looking for in order to take the steps to get there. I will never forget the past. We never should forget it. It informs us of the conditions we are working in, but we need to focus on what we can build for the future. Community groups that I'm either part of or been touched by often say, the youth right now are the truth right now. I couldn't say that better myself. When I lose hope for change to come from older generations, I remind myself of the powerful people my age and younger. My peers are the ones who keep me grounded in this work. Being around powerful, compassionate, revolutionary young people is a reminder of the strength we have when we come together. Kids younger than me are inspiring as well. They fill me with hope because of the kindness that they show, the lack of prejudiced ideas instilled inside of them, and the willingness that they have to learn. I'm beyond excited to see what my generation and future ones will do. The necessity and urgency for change is what propels many of us forward. For you adults, I believe that one of the most important jobs you have is to listen to the youth and see us as important. See us as powerful. See us as your future. We are, whether you like that or not. We've seen monumental change happen in the past. We've seen empires rise and fall, and it's clear it can happen in the future. I'm thankful for Dr. King for inspiring me in my early years and all those who have inspired me since. I'm extraordinarily grateful to be sharing this day with everyone here. Thank you all.
Thank you again, Asher. Amazingly inspiring, and your words have resonated with all of us here today. Based on the experiences that you've had, you've written this wonderful book that I really hope you all will get a chance to look through it, read it, learn about how we can make education system and our cities better places for everyone. So now that you've informed us a little bit of the history and your experiences that have informed this book, we're going to go ahead and do a few questions with you that will talk a little bit more about ways that you can impact change from where we're at. So I'm going to hand you this mic, and I'm going to go there. Okay, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Meanwhile, we have around the room folks with cards that will be passed around. So if you have questions, you can write it down on that card. The ushers will bring it forth, and we can read those cards, okay? So if you have any question, raise your hand. I'll go ahead and start with some of the questions of my own. So kind of delving a little bit deeper in your book, Azure, you bring up notions of segregation and representation, whether that's internalized through just questioning and your connectedness to Blackness because of the programs that you were in or the access that you had, or implicit and explicitly by design, so that there was a disproportionate amount of Black students who were in advanced classes. So the question is, can you elaborate more on this from your experience and from the experiences that you've heard in your interviews?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, when I was growing up, I was in the HCC program, which happens to be a very white program. And for me, I have a white mom. My Black father lives across the country. So being in that program, living with a white mom, I was very much surrounded by whiteness growing up. And as someone who is not white, who does not look white, it was hard for me to figure out what my identity was for many years, especially when being in that program made me feel as if it was wrong of me to be that way, because it made me feel isolated from other people. It was harder to make friends. It was harder to fit in. I felt like I was being treated differently. And it took a while for me to realize that no, being Black is a beautiful thing. It's something that I should love about myself. It's something that I should be proud of. And I can say now that I am. But I think that is one of the biggest impacts it had on my life. It really lowered my self-esteem growing up. It made it harder for me to love and accept who I was because of this segregation, and because of being the only Black student in a classroom for many years. I've heard very similar things from other students of color in this program. A lot of us have a very similar story around this. And I also think it's incredibly important for me to emphasize that, yes, I had this negative impact, but the students who are in general program have an incredibly hard time. And I can't speak on that from my own experience, but I know from what I've been told by these individuals that they really did view themselves as less than from the entire time that they were growing up because of the existence of this program and because of the clear segregation of it. I don't think that any student of color is receiving benefits from this program existing at all.
Thank you. Again, if you have a question, raise your hand, and then somebody will come by with a card and a pencil as well. The next question that I have here is about history and how it's biased or unbiased, and you know, you reference this in your book several times of just the representation that exists in history books. The New York Times recently published an article that analyzed popular social studies books, and it was about 90% of them that were not representative of the history that is made up here in the U.S. And this study was specifically in California and Texas, so comparing those. And then you also mention it in your book through an article from Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me, that also compares about 18 books. And then from an expert in your book that I'll read really quickly, and then I'll provide the question, but your excerpt says, schools teach selective pieces of history that they want us to learn. And you also bring this up in your speech today really well, rather than giving us a big picture and a reality. History classes tend to be Eurocentric. It's almost as if history of other places is negligible up until European context, which you mentioned. Moving through the education system as a Black student was a difficult aspect. I was taught all the names and backgrounds of European colonizers, but I didn't know any of my own history. Again, as you mentioned in your speech earlier, can you tell us more about how we can bring in the recognition of history in these classes, and also how can we do better at not excluding some of this history?
It's a great question. I think that there's a few things that are immediately coming to my mind. One is being, of course, the textbooks that are used in classrooms are often very much based in a European perspective. But there are textbooks that are not written from that perspective, such as the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States is a textbook that comes from Indigenous people's perspective. I also think that it's really important to have educators of color, especially in history classes, because learning about your own history from someone who you can connect with on that level is not something that I've ever experienced. I've never had a Black history teacher. The only 2 Black teachers I've had were last year in this quarter, ever. I also think that a huge piece of the curriculum and something that people in the Seattle district are fighting for is mandating ethnic studies as a graduation requirement, and also being able to cross-credit that with core curriculum classes. So you could take ethnic studies and get a history credit rather than just getting an elective credit. And I think ethnic studies is a class that, 1, everyone should be needs to take. And 2, from what I have heard from students of color, everyone says it's the best class they've ever taken. It was a class where they felt like they could open up. It was a class where they felt that they were learning things that really mattered to them in a way that other classes didn't quite resonate. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done within the curriculum. Those are just a few of my initial thoughts.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, now we have here a question from somebody in the crowd. So you're talking to a room full of public servants. How do you envision local government supporting Black and transgender people?
I think that local government should, I think that having events like these is really important. I think that you told me about a Trans Remembrance Day that you had all done. However, I think that relying on people within government for this type of work isn't always the most effective all the time. I think that a lot of this needs to be coming from community organizations with people who do this work in a community setting rather than in a government setting. And that doesn't mean that government can't do anything, but I think that I at least do not rely on government to provide that support for me.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. More specifically, can you tell us about what actions just community could be taken or taking to reduce the rates of murder against transgender individuals? What are some actions that both audiences and community can do to bring more awareness to it?
Yeah. I think the first step for any person is to check yourself. Check what beliefs you hold personally. A lot of people have transphobia that they might not really be aware of, that might come in the form of not using people's correct pronouns, not seeing trans women as real women, or not thinking that they should use a women's restroom. And these might seem like just personal beliefs, but they all go inside this idea that transgender people are less than. And I think that that is the first step that everyone needs to take and do some reflection for yourself. And I think that after that, I don't think that conversations are the end-all, be-all, but I think that it's important to just have these conversations and not, and I think there's a fine line between pushing people too hard so that they get pushed out, but also not just accepting that some people are transphobic, because it's not okay to be transphobic. That's not something that you should just accept of people. And I agree that it might take time for some people to come around. I know this from my father has some difficulties with this, and it's work. It's work and it's patience, but it's necessary. It's necessary to reduce this concept that transgender people don't deserve to live and don't deserve to exist as who they are.
Thank you. So this is going to be kind of close to our last question. If we have more time, we will answer more questions. But one of the reasons that we were really excited to bring you here as a keynote was not only because of your powerful book, but also within the notion that youth activism exists and is alive and is the driving force for many changes that we see in our current history. We know that your book has created a lot of conversation in the educational system within Seattle public schools, with administrators, and then also local leaders. Can you summarize 3 main topics that have come up from these conversations? And what are the commitments being made to address those issues?
Yeah. Number one that comes to mind is immediately people start talking about the honors program. That is definitely the main thing that people immediately are interested in talking about. I think it's because it's like a hot topic right now in a lot of ways. So people just want to hear what I have to say about that. And I know a lot of people are honestly not always in a kind way, but very, very much argumentative around this topic. I try to be very blunt with my opinion on this. I stick to what I believe on this. I think it needs to be dismantled, and I already stated why. So that's one conversation that I noticed has come up, or it already was around, but my book, I think, kind of added something to that conversation. Another thing that I've noticed come up is educators really wanting to learn how to support their students of color and figuring out the ways that they can do that effectively. And I think that is a fantastic conversation to be starting. I think it's really important for educators to be thinking about that and thinking about how, when you're fighting a system that's deeply ingrained with racism, you need to be doing a little extra for certain students to make them feel like they deserve to be in that classroom and that they're welcome there. Trying to think of a good third one. I think probably the idea of representation in curriculum is definitely something that's come up, and I've kind of already gone over how that has looked. But again, I think it's really important for us to be reevaluating what our students are taught and how they're taught it and who they're taught by.
And I'll ask one last question. Any plans for a second book?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I don't think I've really shared this with that many people, some people, but I'll give you the premise of this book, of my next book is, so the first book was really centered around me being really mad and me being really disappointed in everything. This book is going to challenge me because I have to be a bit optimistic with this one. And that is a bit harder for me to do, but I love a challenge. And the idea of this book is centered around hope and transformation and asking students of color less about what's going wrong, but more about what do you want to see? What would make you happy in your life? What is a world you want to live in? What would a school that you want to attend look like? So I'm kind of redirecting the focus. And another big aspect of the second book is going to talk about more intersectional issues, because I feel like I talked a little bit about myself and my gender and sexuality, but I want to hear more directly from other students, and a lot of that will be direct student submissions that they can submit to me about their own experiences. I'm really excited about this one. I think it's going to be a challenge for me. I'm not the most optimistic person, but I think it's healthy to reframe my mindset a bit.
Thank you, Asher. So with that, we are actually going to close down the program. We have Bellevue School District who could not make it because they had 2 snow days this week, and we were close to really having a ton of students here to engage in a conversation. However, due to the weather, they were not able to make it. However, I really do hope that you get a chance to, if you didn't ask Asher the questions that you had, you get a chance to catch him here for a little bit. After this program is done, LT and DLs are going to convene for another conversation with Asher. And I have a small token of appreciation from Bellevue that I'd like to give you. Thank you. And can we please give Asher one last round of applause? With that, you are dismissed.
And I would just like to introduce former State Representative Jesse Wineberry. Thank you for being here today.
Oh, one more thing. If you want to support me in my work, my book is for sale over there. You can meet my really cool mom. You can talk to my friends who are going to help me. And support me, please. It helps me a lot.
Thank you for being here.